It's Jianghu Hustle.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Jianghu Hustle. I'm here with my co-host Eric Farmer.
And I'm here with my co-host Eli Kurtz.
Today we're chatting about The Bride with White Hair, a film loosely adapted from a novel by 20th century wuxia pioneer Liang Yusheng.
Right, coming from the sort of golden age of the Hong Kong movie renaissance in the early 90s. This one does have some content warnings, so if you're going to check out Bride with White Hair, content warnings include sexual assault, gore, self-harm, and incest. It's kind of a gross one, but it is spooky Halloween times.
That's right, and spooky Halloween times are almost always problematic, at least a little bit, and this is no exception.
Right. And this is more than a little bit, but definitely more enjoyable, I think, than our last Halloween pick.
I think so, too. Yeah, I did not cast my TV across the room in disgust at this one. So, starting off on a good foot. Before we get into the discussion, we want to thank all of our patrons. And we missed you last time, so this time it'll be a double thank you. And with no more ado, Anders Gabrielson, Andreas DeVore, Andrew Dacey, Brian Kurtz, Craig, Dave, David Millions, Derek Smith, Eric Bontz, Fraser Ronald, Gallant Night Games, J. David Chrisman, Jared Rasher, Jason Detman, Jeremy Marr, Jim, John Cole, Kevin Lovecraft, Laura Penrod, Leonard Murphy, Liam Murray, Lowell Francis, Misdirected Mark Productions, PK, Rob Abrazado, Sean Nicholson, Sean P. Kelly, and Todd Crapper. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, everyone, for contributing. If you are not a patron, that's totally cool. But if you want to swing by patreon.com/Jianghu Hustle and drop us $1 or $2. We'd really appreciate it. All that money goes towards our future endeavors with this project. So
that's right. Although we are at the stretch goal level where we are also supporting a charity and another creator. So most of the money that we have goes toward our game design, but not 100%.
Right. So do good. Give us a couple of dollars.
That's right. Speaking of doing good, this movie did some good all over the place.
It sure did. So The Bride with White Hair came out in 1993. Its director was Ronnie Yu, and you have some extra details about Ronnie Yu, don't you?
I do. He has quite an eclectic directing history. One of the most Western directors that we've seen, in fact, so far, I think. The one that people would probably recognize is Jet Li's Fearless from 2006. But he also directed Bride of Chucky from 1998, Freddy vs. Jason from 2003, and my personal favorite, Warriors of Virtue, the kangaroo kung fu movie from 1997.
So no stranger to horror, then.
No, not at all.
So Bride with White Hair was also written by Ronnie Yu, Lam Kato, Elsa Tong, and David Wu. The cinematography was by Peter Pao and Lee Tok-shing, and the stunt coordinator was Philip Kwok.
And the cast, I think this is the first movie we've seen with Bridget Lin. She played Lian Nichang, the protagonist, the eponymous Bride with White Hair. Also, Leslie Chung as Zhuo Yihang, and Francis Ng and Elaine Louis as conjoined twins Ji Wushuang.
Problematic element number 1.
Yes, indeed.
All right. So, to get into the plot of the movie, in a brief prologue, we flash forward to a group of warriors climbing a mountain seeking a flower with properties that can save their master. They find a Shah already there. When they demand the flower for themselves, he kills them all.
Then we flash back to the beginning of the story proper, where Zhuo Yihang was raised by Taoist Ziyang of the Wudang sect and groomed to be a chivalrous swordsman. He's tasked with leading a coalition force formed by the 8 major orthodox martial arts sects to counter an evil cult.
During a battle against the cult, Zhuo Yihang meets a young woman, Lian Nichang, and falls in love with her. She's an orphan and was raised by wolves as an infant before being adopted by Ji Wushuang, the conjoined twins who lead the cult. After consummating their romance, Lian Nichang decides to leave the cult and follow Zhuo Yihang in pursuit of an ordinary life away from the martial artists community.
Lian Nichang succeeds in leaving the cult after suffering great pains, Meanwhile, Zhuo Yihang returns to Wudan and is horrified to see that his fellows have been murdered. The coalition members believe that Lian Nichang is responsible, so they attack her when she arrives to meet Zhuo Yihang. Zhuo Yihang is forced to turn against Lian Nichang.
Devastated by her lover's betrayal, Lian Nichang morphs into a vicious white-haired killer and slays all of the coalition members present. Suddenly, Ji Wushuang appears and reveals that he/she is actually the one who killed the Wudong members. Zhuo Yihang and Lian Nichang join forces to defeat and kill Ji Wushuang. However, even after the victory, Lian Nichang vows never to forgive Zhuo Yihang for betraying her and walks away while he looks on helplessly.
And then, in a brief epilogue set years later, Zhuo Yihang is alone in a remote mountain region guarding this rare flower that we saw at the beginning that's said to bloom only once every several decades and has the ability to reverse the effects of aging. Believing that it can cure the harm he has inflicted on Lian Nichang, he awaits for the return of his loved one and hopes that she will show up.
Right. This has kind of a standard story. It has a lot of like what we saw in Sorcerer and the White Snake, or any group where there's two people in love that can't be together for whatever reason.
Yeah.
But this one's got kind of a layer of horror and sort of grotesquerie draped across the top of it.
Mm-hmm.
The cult in particular is particularly wild.
Yeah. Well, we forgot a content warning for nudity, I suppose, because I was kind of blindsided by that. But yeah, surprise, there's a content warning for nudity. The cult definitely gets up to some stuff, and the conjoined twins are, on the one hand, an interesting display of scale. They seem to be able to hurt people with just the force of their voice, but there are also a lot of really sort of unfortunate elements tied up in their presentation one way or another. But yeah, you were talking about how this is sort of a star-crossed lovers thing, and I was reading a little bit about the movie, and it turns out that the director was familiar with the novel and chose to adapt it loosely because he saw potential for what he described as a Romeo and Juliet story. You can really see that in the story itself. It's definitely forbidden love, star-crossed, one clan and another, etc., etc.
So Zhuo Yihang is the heir apparent to these 8 clans of martial artists, of orthodox martial artists. And he's been being groomed his whole life to become the leader. But they're not great.
No.
They definitely war upon people that don't deserve it. And don't do a great job of protecting the people that need to be protected.
Yeah, they withhold help based on politics, basically.
Right. And so the cult, while they are unnatural and they are definitely sinister, have kind of a case to be mad at the clans, the standard clans. They're definitely rivals in this world, but they're both dysfunctional in a way that's very much sort of your Montagues and your Capulets. They'll never see eye to eye.
Right. And, as soon as I heard the bad guys described as a cult, it made me immediately think of what we had learned while watching Laughing in the Wind, where they talk about how, or in the course of research and discussion, we found out that the Sun Moon Holy Cult in particular was very likely an homage to Islam. And so there's that element tied up with this too. As soon as I saw the mention of the bad guys being a cult, I was like, oh, okay, are they just some sort of marginalized community of some kind? And, a lot of wuxia is melodramatic and it's elemental, and that paints with a broad brush that obscures a lot of nuance. I guess what I'm saying is that while this cult was presented as bad, I kept asking myself, but what was it like in the historical record with this cult, if it did exist in history, if it wasn't purely a fantasy?
Yeah, this felt like a fictional cult to me. It was very much like, well, what does a cult look like? Well, people dance around in acrobatic ways and drink blood and, get naked and, generally are sort of perverse according to the standards of like what we see like with the rest of the normal society.
Yeah.
You're right. It was painted with a very broad brush. And I was like, but I knew right away what I was looking at once it started to happen. Once the cult showed up, you're like, oh, okay, these guys are sinister and weird. But they weren't, because the 8 Orthodox clans weren't great. I also didn't really like them either.
I agree. Yeah. I mean, there was the scene where the heir apparent, Zhuo Yihang, is sort of being berated by his master about being tardy and kind of a layabout and that sort of thing. And he ends up covering for all of the other disciples who were actually way worse than he was. And then afterward, they sort of bring him bribes to keep that gravy train flowing. And you can see the dysfunction there. It's not the same kind of dysfunction that you would see in the cult. The cult is a much more marginalized portrayal, whereas the 8 clans are more like, oh yeah, well, we're super powerful and we've consolidated that power over time. And so what we're going to do here is abuse it and get really entitled about it and that sort of thing.
Right. It created an interesting dynamic where the two main characters, Zhuo Yihang on the Orthodox side and Lian Nichang on the cult side, could come together in a way that like felt romantic. And again, the romance was it was damp, is what it was. This is an early '90s movie. There's a lot of love making under waterfalls for quite a long time.
Yeah,
but it's this very like overwrought sort of romance and sex that's going on.
Mm-hmm. You described it to me as soggy when you were watching it, and you couldn't be more right. I mean, just to paint a picture here, there are 4 sex scenes that happen back to back, and it's like sex, make out under a waterfall, sex, make out under a waterfall, 4 times.
It's not a long movie.
No,
it's only an hour and a half.
It's not. And
yeah,
and they all just crammed it right into the middle there. It was really something. I will say it was kind of, I think I knew at the beginning who the bride with white hair was going to be, but because she didn't actually have white hair, there was maybe 10 or 15 minutes where I was like, well, wait, am I watching the right movie? Eventually I confirmed, oh yes, no, this is definitely the right movie. But yeah, that was a little bit of a slow build. Something else about the bride, though, being raised by wolves, that made me think immediately of Princess Mononoke, which came out in 1997, and it's a Japanese movie, but I wondered if there was some kind of inspiration there, since this one came out early enough in advance that, you know, Miyazaki could have been inspired in that way.
Sure, yeah, that might be interesting. I know this movie was a pretty big hit, so it is certainly possible that it was seen that way. But it's Halloween, right? So we can leave Romeo and Juliet aside, and let's talk about sort of the horror elements from the movie. And the word that described this movie the best to me was grotesque. There's gore. There's a whip that cuts people in half. There is a
cuts people
conjoined
into 8
twin.
pieces, in fact.
Yes. There's a conjoined twin that is played for like spooky, sinister, perverse, incestuous themes in ways that are, of course, problematic, but it is a sort of quasi-horror movie. Let's talk about what I mean by the grotesque, because I think it's important to bring this definition in. And the definition I found is by Joyce Carol Oates, who wrote a great collection of short stories based in sort of the grotesque. And this is what she has to say. Quote, "The arts of the grotesque are so various as to resist definition. Here we have the plenitude of the imagination itself. From the Anglo-Saxon saga of Grendel's mother monster in Beowulf to impish ugly gargoyles carved on cathedral walls. From terrifyingly matter-of-fact scenes from carnage in the Iliad to the hallucinatory vividness of the remarkable piece of apparatus of Franz Kafka's In the Penal Colony. From the comic nightmare images of Hieronymus Bosch to the strategic artfulness of 20th century film. Werner Herzog's 1979 remake of the 1922 classic of the German silent screen F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu the Vampire, to give but one example. The grotesque is a sensibility that accommodates the genius of Goya and the kitsch surrealism of Dali, the crude visceral power of H.P. Lovecraft, and the baroque elegance of Isaac Dinesen. The fatalistic simplicity of Grimm's fairy tales and the complexity of vision in which, for instance, William Faulkner's A Rose for Emily is a supreme example. The grotesque image as historical commentary." So there was a lot. I mean, Joyce Carol Oates is a good writer, and she wrote a lot there on the grotesque. But it is something that is shocking, but also matter of fact. And I think that's really well represented in this movie. I actually think it was well represented in Human Lanterns. We just didn't really like the story as much.
Right.
But I think that bringing an element of shock, and bringing in an element of perversity, and just sort of like putting it out there is a pretty effective way to sort of unseat people and make them uncomfortable. Even in a situation where the characters are of such high scale as they are in this movie, we can still be put off by like the weirdness and the grossness of what we're seeing. So it is more of a thematic and atmospheric than more of like a plot or drama tool.
Yeah, I think the way you summarized it as being both shocking and matter of fact is really well evidenced for me by that whip you mentioned. It's the sort of weapon that you would expect to see as like a grappling tool or as something that's going to like knock off somebody's eye or something like that. And then the first time it's used, it just cuts a person into pieces. And that is shocking, but it's also just what happens. And that happens a lot throughout the movie. And it becomes sort of matter of fact in the same way that like a slasher villain goring someone to death becomes matter of fact in the course of a slasher movie. We also talk about, so when we were talking about the decadence of the Jianghu in this contrasted with the cult, that showed me what I might describe as like a really pervasive kind of depravity in this movie. You get the gore and you get the violence and you get what the majority culture considers to be perverse. But then you also get the majority culture behaving badly and not really fulfilling its duty. And that's something that's really common in horror too, because you need your protagonists to be eligible for suffering in some way. Right. They need to transgress on their own to deserve the things that a horror movie is going to put them through.
And they can't have a reliable resource to go to.
Right.
They can't call the cops.
Yeah. And in wuxia, often there is an unreliable authority, but the protagonists are heroes who are supplanting or replacing that unreliable authority. Whereas in this one, and in a few others that we've seen as well, the Jianghu and the protagonists are complicit in that uselessness.
So I think that we see when we talk about a perversion of wuxia or sort of the Shah code, right? We see it on the side where the Shah has essentially stepped up to become the government of this region. And they are failing, right? And then a dark side version of them, this cult, steps into their role. It's interesting to see where the perversity sort of springs from.
Yeah. That kind of inverts the entire wuxia paradigm in some ways, in the sense that Shah often arise whenever the reigning order or prevailing order is weakened. And here they're weakened by becoming sort of despicable, and then something more despicable takes their place, as opposed to falling from glory and glorious people come in to fill the gap.
I think because this is in the horror setting, I think the sort of like despair of an era sort of creates that feeling that leads to the grotesque, right?
Yeah.
Like this, everybody's at war. Even the great Shah are no good. They only look after themselves, right? So now we have to turn to this group who is potentially just as powerful, but is dangerous in a different way. And we get to see that expressed through like magic and unusual cult behavior and, just all manner of different unnatural things. Like the conjoined twins Jiu Shuang, they speak at the same time. And so they have this weird sort of reverb voice that shifts back and forth between the male voice and the female voice. And, it's pretty effective, but it also shows you that like we have entered a heterotopia off of our heterotopia.
Yeah, I agree. First of all, that voice was really effective for me. I thought it was a really cool display of scale to see them synchronized in that way. But it doubled down on the notion that this is not your typical wuxia story. Something that we've talked about with Master of the Flying Guillotine was that movie felt a lot like a slasher movie.
Oh, yeah.
In the sense that there was this inevitable foe who just sort of followed the protagonists relentlessly. And in this movie, we see that there is an inevitable foe or two, but it doesn't quite capture those same slasher vibes. You know, when I think about a slasher movie, I think about this like glacier of a being slowly, inexorably following the protagonists. And we didn't necessarily get that in this. I think instead, the thing that was inevitable in this story was the downfall of the protagonists, but it wasn't personified in a character exactly. It sort of jumped between characters and it didn't show up until later and that sort of thing.
Right.
But we still get that notion, like when the bride, when her hair goes white and she becomes a depraved killer, and with Ji Wuxuang at the end in their big moment of let's officially get awful, both of those are examples of this sort of super-powered, super deadly, bloodthirsty character.
I think because the stories themselves have different spines, they come out differently. Like this is sort of the doomed romance spine, whereas the other one was much more of a traditional martial arts story, but then we drop in an indomitable monster. But it's interesting to see the difference, because when I was thinking about other grotesque movies that we've watched, Master of the Flying Guillotine definitely has its moments of just gnarly stuff happening.
Yeah.
The chickens getting killed, the people's heads getting taken off.
Right. The guy who gets trapped in the house when it's burning down.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of that same visceral but matter-of-fact horror in that as well.
Yeah, I agree. I kind of want to move on and talk a little bit about some other things that we noticed, but before I do, I want to acknowledge that the grotesque in media, period, is often a sort of disgusting presentation of things that the majority culture finds objectionable. And that is often really problematic, like we've said, and wuxia is no exception to that. We've seen the ways that wuxia has been nationalistic. We've seen the ways that it has been used basically for propaganda. And we've talked a little bit about, especially in Laughing in the Wind, I think we touched on this, how there was this character, Dongfeng Bubai, who gains power basically by, I don't know that it's totally clear in the context of history if Dongfeng Bubai is transgender or if they're just a crossdresser or whatever, but the moral of the story is that the more of their masculinity that they give up and the more femininity that they embrace, the more power that they get. And that's presented in the story as being very taboo. And that's like the clearest symbol in the context of the story that this person is bad. And of course, by our modern standards, we do not have the same viewpoint. By our Western standards, we do not have the same viewpoint. There are a lot of ways that our perspective differs from these perspectives. And the things that we found problematic in this movie are an effective representation of the genre in a lot of ways. We just need to acknowledge that they're not super cool.
Yeah, and I also think that if you're going to include the grotesque and the horror in your game, that you talk about it beforehand.
Yeah.
And then you put some safety tools in place, because it is by nature sort of pushing boundaries and pushing the unpleasant in people's faces. Mm-hmm. And that is not a thing that everyone is down for.
Right. Yeah.
So make sure that you get consent for that. But off of that, I want to talk about a perhaps even more dangerous problem that I like to call the Ferris Bueller problem.
Okay.
All right. So in the beginning of this movie, I did not enjoy Zhuo Yihong, the main protagonist of this movie, all that much, because he was part of the Ferris Bueller problem. And what I mean by that is, when I was younger, I really liked Ferris Bueller. I liked the movie. I thought it was really funny. And now when I watch it as an adult, I can't stand it. Because that character, whether it's Ferris Bueller or whether it's Zhuo Yihong, gets everything just sort of handed to them, and their consequences don't matter. And so it makes you feel sort of resentful at the character and somebody is telling you this character is very cool, you should like them.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't get to see them actually do something that we admire. We just get to be told that they are doing admirable things or cool things, even if they're a little naughty, like both of those characters are.
Mm-hmm.
This one, I think, breaks away in the end because Zhuo Yihong breaks, and there are some like melodramatic consequences to his actions. But I think it's a thing to watch out for. I mean, we talk about in fiction, we talk about the Mary Sue or the Marty Stew character that never suffers any sort of like setback, and they're just kind of boring. But more often than that, they are unlikable, or they are not even that they're unlikable, because we have lots of characters that are unlikable that are interesting, right? As long as the character is interesting, they don't have to be likable.
Mm-hmm.
They need to have, their behavior needs to have consequences.
And we see over and over again in this movie, Zhuo Yihong has the best shot at the leadership of the 8 clans. He's got a woman who is just head over heels for him and is always trying to give him gifts and that sort of thing. He has friends who are willing to cover for him. He has these cool sword skills. He's got all these things going for him, and consistently he abuses them. Zhuo Yihong gets this heirloom from this woman who fancies him, and he's going out into the world, and then he encounters this random couple who, she's pregnant and they're attacked and she needs to have the baby right now. And it turns out that she doesn't survive the birth. Another content warning for you. And she is sort of lying there, and the child is there, and the guy is in this situation where he's got a child, but his wife is gone, and I can't imagine how devastating that would be. And Zhuo Yihong gives this pendant, this heirloom, to the guy to help him, get back on his feet or whatever. He can use it for money. And that's a really nice thing to do. But then he gets back, and there's no attempt at providing context or anything like that. It's she says, that was a terrible thing for you to do. And he just kind of rides with it. He's like, okay, yeah, sure, whatever. And that sort of disdain is not likable. Even though he did a nice thing earlier, it's still like, well, you're not, maybe you're understanding the circumstances, the sort of absolutism of the Jianghu here, but come on, man. Like you could at least pretend to care.
Right. I mean, it was a good act, but it also, the thing that he gave away wasn't his to give away.
Right.
I just think it's something to watch out for. I don't think that it comes up that much in tabletop, but I think in terms of like narrative storytelling, we see a lot in movies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Usually in tabletop, I feel if a person is being a lackadaisical jerk, that typically gets called out after a little while, or it causes the group to self-destruct and the game stops one way or another. Right. It's kind of a corrected problem.
Yeah. But maybe if you see that coming, maybe head that off at the pass.
Right.
But that sounds like we're bending into our gameable ideas section. So why don't we move on?
Yeah, sure. So the first thing I want to mention is this notion that we touched on during the research portion, where we talked about how the inverse of wuxia is fruitful ground for a horror story. And I'm wondering, for wuxia specifically, if that's true, but also if it's true more broadly. Is it the case where you take a setting as it is presented, like a real place, and you find the value system of that setting, and then you just corrupt it or turn it on its head, and that's always going to be fruitful ground for horror? This
is just something that popped into my head, but is a slasher movie an inverted superhero movie?
Yeah.
Because we've got unstoppable forces going, doing the opposite of what they are supposed to be doing.
Yeah. I've often thought about what it would be like to see a Batman movie that's from the perspective of the street level criminals, like exclusively.
Oh, sure.
And it's just this like super jacked, armored, gadget ridden bat maniac creature thing that's like beating the crap out of them and ruining their lives. Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And I think we could find that sort of inversion in other genres as well.
I think it's where we take the power levels and we switch them.
Mm-hmm.
What, not so much with wuxia, actually. With the superhero slasher example, it's honestly more of where the power is directed.
Yeah.
Right? Because in this, the power of the standard Wulin is supposed to be directed out like helping people.
Yeah.
And instead it's pointed inwards.
Yeah. And it's eating itself.
Right. And that creates the space for the reverse Wulin, the cult, right, to come out and like solve problems their own way and with their own power.
Yeah.
And that's what creates the horror element. Yeah, I really like that idea. So it's about which way the power directs. And then if you move it away from pointing towards the more powerful thing to pointing towards the weaker thing, then you get horror.
Yeah. Well, but sort of what you were saying also is that if you take the power and you're pointing it internally instead of externally, then you're also going to get a kind of horrific situation. If it is the case that the entire world is built in such a way as to screw you over, then that's a pretty horrific situation in its inescapability, in its unfairness, in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting thing to think about. And what kind of, depending on which way the power dynamic points, is what kind of horror you get.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah.
All right, well, we solved horror.
There we did. We did it.
Cool.
Didn't think we'd get there on a Kung Fu podcast, but there we are.
Hey, it's Halloween, baby.
I think these next two are really like mixed together.
I think you're right. Yeah, we're talking about betrayal and we're talking about melodramatic consequences. Betrayal is obvious all over this movie. There are so many different betrayals. And it's interesting to me because they're kind of forced. Not in a way that's like narratively unsatisfying, but in such a way that it's like, well, your hands are tied. You've got no choice but to accept this betrayal. I think that the chief example is when Lian Nicheng shows up at Wudan to run away with Zhuo Yihang, and everybody at Wudan thinks that she has killed all of the disciples there, and so they attack her. And Zhuo Yihang is like, well, I don't actually know what the truth is, but all of my people are attacking her, and I have to stop this. And in so doing, I make it look like I'm fighting against her. That's her perception of me. And so by standing by my compatriots who have been supportive of me previously in the film, I'm betraying her. And that's sort of an impossible situation for me.
There is a point earlier in the movie where they're sort of professing their love to each other. And she says, you know, the only deal breaker is if you ever don't believe me. And it's like, you might as well have just like put that up on a banner and just run it across the screen.
Right.
Because you're like, this is going to come back later. Right.
Yeah.
And that's why melodramatic consequences and betrayal are just so interlinked. It's because when someone says it's like our talk about disguises, right? Like, I'm going to tell you this thing that is an absolute so that it will break when it is most dramatically fraught.
Right. You can see it in the trope of like, oh, can't wait to go on that date when all this is over. It's like, okay, well, you're dead.
Yep.
See you later.
See you later. And so this one, when she was like, you always have to believe me. And now the GM of the situation is like, okay, well, we need to engineer a situation where it is impossible for Zhuo Yihang to both believe her and also be loyal to his community.
Mm-hmm.
And no matter what happens, it's bad news.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the part that you have to sort of aim for when you deal with melodrama, is we are looking at something that is inevitable, that is going to happen, and we just need to aim the characters in that direction.
Yeah. And in this case, it boils down to conflicting loyalties.
Mm-hmm.
If the promise, if the inevitability that you establish is something to do with loyalty, then all the GM has to do is say, oh, well, where's another loyalty? And then how can I pit those against each other?
Right.
If it's like an aspiration, if it's a goal, then it's maybe even easier. All you really have to do is say, okay, well, what's some way that I can make that goal impossible? It's
not the easiest thing in the world to do, but it is sort of right there. And I think when you play towards it, when you play towards those melodramatic consequences, I think you'll find yourself saying those things that end up becoming inevitable. And I think that's because the characters should have drives, right? They should be going forward in a particular way. When we meet Zhuo Yihang, he's sort of an aimless character. He doesn't really want to be the big boss of the Wulin group that he's in. And when he meets Liang Nishang, that's what gives him his direction.
And it's a direction out of the Wulin, which is totally against all of the people that have supported him this whole time.
He's got so much owed to those people. Yeah, you just start stacking stuff on the other end of the scale, and so they eventually slam together.
Right. Well, and to think about this from the player perspective too, something that you need to do as a player in order to capture that melodramatic sense is to build up, invest a lot in something, and then sort of gleefully turn your back on it. If you like, the more that the player of Zhuo Yihang says, "Oh, hey, well, I care, like I'm connected to this person in my clan, and I'm connected to this person in my clan, and oh, I helped these people out, and then I got a favor from these people too." The more you can tie yourself up with that group, the more narratively satisfying it's going to be when you then say, "Nope, none of that is as important as this thing that I'm doing right now."
It's one of those things that I think is different in a lot of Chinese storytelling, in a lot of our Western storytelling, for lack of a better term. The individual freedoms are what we celebrate. Right? We'd be like, yeah, break away from your abusive, weird family and that sort of thing. But it's a real point of contention in this movie.
Yeah.
I think they give us a little bit of an out because, like, they're not great, but they are still essentially his family.
Yeah, I mean, Chinese culture is so much more collectivist than Western culture. And it makes me wonder if we maybe missed the impact of him turning his back on Wudan. And maybe if we missed the impact of a lot of wuxia films and how often that sort of thing happens where you turn your back on something and then decide that you're just going to live a different life. That might be read much more harshly to a Chinese audience than it would be to us.
Right. And I think that's something that when we bring it to the table, that we need to make sure that we're putting extra weight on that side to counteract our sort of biases in terms of storytelling from where we are. We need to make sure that those family connections are mechanically and narratively heavy enough to pull your character back.
We really want to gasp when that happens. So you have any other ideas for gameable ideas?
I think we've covered it. I think just remember to mess with the power structure, right? And then I think rolling back to the grotesque, I think that should have some sort of thematic. It should show up in the themes of your game.
Yeah.
If you're playing a horror game, think about what that would do to the society, and make sure that your themes point that way, that they show that something is wrong.
Yeah. Consider how you can sort of view society through a twisted lens, and how you can do that in a way that's going to make everybody happy. That's actually a really good segue into our Stealing as Art section. You had mentioned safety tools as a necessary part of a horror game, and I think that being able to present the grotesque in a way that's going to make everybody feel like they're still enjoying the story in the game, it requires safety tools.
It does.
Yeah, I think, and I don't know that this is really like a point of contention among any of our listeners. I think most of the listeners of the show, in one way or another, are at least familiar with safety tools like through the rest of the Misdirected Mark Network or wherever. But anytime I play any game, but especially when I play a horror game, I sit down and I'm like, okay, people, this is a horror game. It's going to be tough. There are going to be some gross things that are going to happen. They're going to make you a little uncomfortable. The point is to unsettle and scare you a little bit. But this is also a game, and we're having fun here. And everybody's fun is going to look a little bit different. And so it's good to set some boundaries at the beginning and to give people outs during the game so that we can push those limits and get to those really thrilling, scary depths without burning anybody, without ruining anybody's experience.
Right. Because the people at your table are more important. And if you think about Bride with White Hair as a game, we could if the grotesque elements were too much, or they were things that people weren't interested in, we could still back those away till we got to a point. We'd still have a really good Romeo and Juliet kind of tragic love story, even after we peeled back some of those kind of gross layers. Your game will survive.
It will, and it will actually be better for it. I think that, so there are a lot of safety tools that are well known, and I think one that works especially well for horror games is lines and veils. If you can establish things at the beginning that are okay and that aren't okay, or that are like okay only to touch briefly upon, you're going to be a lot better off. But a safety tool that I don't see mentioned often, and it's almost not a safety tool. It's basically like when you are playing a game, it's good if a person can speak up and say, hey, this is harmful to me and I don't want to go there. What is better is if you can all look out for each other, and if you notice that somebody else is having a hard time, to pause and say, hey, I don't know that we're all on board here. Can we check in with everyone? Because, being able to speak up for yourself is a cool thing, but it's something that a lot of people are trained not to do in their lives. And being able to help out your buds is a great thing to do all the time.
Safety tool that's specifically built for something along those lines is Bo Sheldon's script change. So definitely take a look at that.
Absolutely, yeah. I also want to give a shout out to the OK Check-In, which I first heard on Pandas Talking Games with Phil and Senda. That one is a very simple tool. It's basically like if you notice somebody's having a tough time and you don't want to interrupt the flow of the game, you make eye contact with them, you do like an OK hand symbol, and they can either give you a thumbs up to say I'm good, kind of a wavy hand to say this is kind of tough, or a thumbs down to say we got to stop. And that is nice because it can happen in the midst of another scene, and you're not interrupting play unless it really needs to be interrupted.
Yeah, sounds great. And then there's one that you and I actually played together.
Yesterday.
Wow.
Time flies. This is Trophy, written by Jesse Ross and published in a Gauntlet zine. And from what I understand, Trophy Gold is in the works to be published as the Gauntlet's second full publication.
Why don't you fill them in on sort of what Trophy's about and then what you would steal from Trophy?
Yeah, so Trophy, in a nutshell, is a game about despicable treasure hunters who are going into a forest that doesn't want them. And in the course of 5 scenes, 5 rings, as the terminology of the game goes, you are exposed to increasingly worse horrors, and you're probably not going to make it out alive. If you do make it out alive, you'll be ruined and probably alone, and you will have betrayed a bunch of people. And that betrayal aspect is exactly what I thought of when I watched The Bride Without Hair. The way the betrayal mechanic works is that you have a ruin track, and it's sort of your hit points. It's in reverse. You start off with 1 ruin, and as you gain ruin, you get conditions. Yesterday when we played, you had a condition where your teeth were falling out and they were being replaced by shark teeth, which I thought was cool. Really fun. Yeah.
That was cool.
And then if your ruin gets up to 6, then you lose control of your character. Maybe that means that your character twists into something antagonistic, or maybe it means you die. You get to decide for yourself what that means, but one way or another, you can't continue playing as your character. The cool thing is that when you get to ruin 5, when you're right on the threshold, you can start to reduce your ruin count. And the only way you can do that is by betraying the other players. You do some action to drive a wedge between them, to hurt them, to mislead them, whatever you want to do, and then you roll and you see if you can decrease your ruin track. And even though, like, if you get it down to 4, that's your new threshold. You can still continue to work off ruin. You just can't do it until you first get to ruin 5.
Betrayal becomes almost, you have to make a choice once you hit a certain threshold of, do I start betraying people or do I die?
Yeah.
And that's very wuxia.
Yeah.
Right. We're hitting a crisis point where I can't accept any more dramatic consequences and still be my character.
But you can give other people dramatic consequences and still be your character. You just become despicable for it.
I like it. It was a great game. And that's lifted from Cthulhu Dark, but I almost think it works better in Trophy. So I would really recommend people check it out.
Is it basically a direct lift from Cthulhu Dark in that regard?
It is. Yeah. It's, that was the sort of the sanity die.
Okay.
But in that one, it was your insanity die. I'm sorry. And you could reduce your insanity by like destroying evidence.
Gotcha. So it's maybe not like a direct betrayal of the other characters in the sense that you could like hurt them, but you are hindering their investigation. Right.
Exactly. And so I think actually in Trophy, it nestles in a little better. And really creates that so despicable, grotesque themes that we saw in this movie.
Yeah. And I think something that kind of softens the blow of the reduction roll in Trophy, and maybe this is something that's included Arc 2, but I'm not familiar with the game, is that as you play through the game, everyone is responsible for collaboratively imagining the consequences of any given action. And so by the time anybody gets up to the point where they're able to make a reduction roll and betray somebody else to work off their ruin, everybody has already had a chance to get comfortable with doing uncomfortable things to these characters, to making their lives worse. And then by the time you can actually do that directly through your character, it's like, oh, well, this is the tone of the game at this point. And that makes it a little more okay because it's in the spirit of what we all agreed to do together.
Yeah. Yeah. So with all of that wrapped up, we want to wish everybody a spooky Halloween, and thanks for listening. And remember to make your kung fu stronger.
And spookier.
Jianghu Hustle is being released on Misdirected Mark Productions, the media arm of Encoded Designs.
If you're enjoying the show, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/Jianghu Hustle. You can reach Eli at ZapDynamic on Twitter or on his website, mythicgazetteer.com. You can reach me at Eric M. Farmer on Twitter or at my website, dogpoweredvehicle.com. You can reach both of us at Jianghu Hustle on Twitter or jianghuhustle@gmail.com or on the Misdirected Mark website. Thanks for listening.